The steam rose like a ghost from the pot, carrying with it the unfamiliar scent of garlic and herbs that drifted through the camp kitchen. Sergeant Michael Rossi watched with a mixture of pride and apprehension as he stirred the boiling water, his movements careful and deliberate. Around him, a small crowd had gathered, American guards and kitchen staff, their faces showing curiosity and skepticism in equal measure. It was autumn of 1943, and in this prisoner of war camp, tucked away in the rolling hills of Louisiana, something extraordinary was unfolding. Not an escape attempt, not a riot, but a quiet revolution that began with a simple request: "Let us cook for you." The Americans had laughed at first. What could enemy soldiers possibly know about food that would interest them? Yet here they stood, watching as Rossi and 5 other Italian prisoners transformed the mundane camp kitchen into something that smelled like the streets of Naples. The head cook, a burly man named Frank Miller, crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "That don't smell like any army food I know," he muttered, but there was curiosity in his voice. Did these prisoners, men they were supposed to guard and fear, truly have something to teach them about the simple pleasure of a meal? For Rossi, the moment carried weight beyond the steam and bubbling water. Just 6 months earlier, he had been fighting in North Africa, convinced that capture by Americans would mean torture, starvation, or worse. Now he stood in a well-stocked kitchen, teaching his captors how to properly cook pasta. The irony was not lost on him. As he glanced around at the faces watching his every move, he wondered if they could possibly understand what this moment meant. Not just the sharing of a recipe, but the first fragile bridge across a divide created by war.
"In Italia, la pasta is alive," Rossi explained in broken English, lifting the wooden spoon to show how the strands moved in the water. "You must respect her." A young guard chuckled, but Miller silenced him with a look. The Americans might not have understood the words fully, but something in Rossi's reverence transcended language. It spoke of home, of tradition, of normalcy in a world turned upside down by conflict. And as the steam continued to rise, carrying with it the promise of something none of them had anticipated, a question hung in the air. How could something as simple as food begin to transform enemies into something else entirely? The journey that brought Rossi and his fellow Italians to this American kitchen had been long and filled with fear. Like most Italian soldiers captured in North Africa, they had been fed stories about American brutality, tales of prisoners starved, beaten, forced to work until they collapsed.
As their transport ship approached the American coast in the spring of 1943, many had stood on deck, gazing at the shoreline with dread in their hearts. Some had whispered prayers, others had clutched small mementos from home, preparing for what they believed would be years of misery, if they survived at all. The first surprise had been the processing center in Virginia. Instead of being thrown into cells, they were registered, given medical examinations, and issued clean uniforms. The American guards, while stern, showed none of the cruelty they had expected. Food appeared regularly, simple fare, but plentiful. Bread, meat, vegetables, even fruit occasionally. For men who had subsisted on dwindling rations in the North African campaign, such abundance seemed suspicious. "It is propaganda," some whispered. "They feed us well only until the Red Cross inspectors leave." Antonio Bianchi, a corporal from Sicily, could not sleep that first week. He kept waiting for the mask to drop, for the real treatment to begin. Instead, he found himself on a train heading southwest, watching through the windows as America unfolded before him. Endless fields, small towns where children waved at passing trains, forests that seemed to stretch forever. It was not the America he had been taught to expect, a land of crowded slums and desperate poverty. This landscape spoke of abundance, of space, of resources that made Italy's struggles seem all the more painful by comparison. When they arrived at Camp Clybourne in Louisiana, the reality of their situation began to sink in. Barbed wire encircled the compound, watchtowers stood at regular intervals, and guards with rifles patrolled the perimeter. Yet inside the fence, life assumed a rhythm that felt almost normal. Barracks were clean, meals came 3 times daily, and gradually, cautiously, the prisoners began to exhale. They were not going to be executed. They were not going to starve. They were, in the strangest way, safe. But safety alone could not erase the profound disorientation of captivity. As weeks passed, a heaviness settled over the men. Not fear now, but a deep, aching homesickness. They missed their families, their villages, the familiar rhythms of Italian life. Most of all, perhaps, they missed the food. The American meals, while plentiful, tasted strange to them. Overcooked vegetables, bland meats, endless potatoes. It was sustenance without soul, fuel without pleasure. And in this absence, Rossi saw an opportunity that would change everything. What began as a simple request, permission to prepare an Italian meal for themselves using the camp kitchen, sparked a hesitant curiosity among the American staff. Captain William Anderson, the camp commander, initially dismissed the idea. "Prisoners don't get special privileges," he told his staff. But the camp's doctor, noticing the growing melancholy among the Italians, suggested that allowing them this small comfort might improve morale and prevent depression. Reluctantly, Anderson agreed to a trial. One meal, supervised, using ingredients from the regular camp supplies. None of them could have predicted what would follow. The morning of the cooking, Rossi and 5 other prisoners with culinary experience were escorted to the kitchen under guard. The American staff watched warily as the Italians surveyed the available ingredients: flour, tomatoes, garlic, olive oil, herbs from the small camp garden. With practiced hands, they began to work. Flour became dough, kneaded reverently and rolled thin. Tomatoes simmered with garlic and herbs, filling the kitchen with an aroma that drew curious onlookers. Even the guards found excuses to pass by, inhaling deeply. Frank Miller, the head cook, who had initially scorned the idea, found himself transfixed by their methods. He had been cooking army meals for 2 years, focusing on quantity and efficiency. These men approached food differently, with patience, with respect, with a kind of devotion he had never considered. They didn't just cook, they performed a ritual that connected them to home. And as he watched them transform simple ingredients into something that smelled increasingly magnificent, Miller felt something unexpected: respect. That evening, when the Italian prisoners sat down to their first taste of home since capture, something shifted in the camp atmosphere. The Americans, invited to try small portions, found themselves speechless. This was not just food, it was revelation. Simple pasta with tomato sauce, but prepared with care that elevated it beyond anything in their experience. Captain Anderson, taking his first cautious bite, paused with his fork midway to his mouth. "This," he said, after a long moment, "is not what I expected." And in that understatement lay the seed of something that would soon blossom across Camp Clybourne: curiosity. What happened in the following weeks revealed how something as humble as food could open doors between worlds that politics had sealed shut. The success of that first meal led to a tentative arrangement. Once a week, the Italian prisoners would cook for themselves, using the same rations as everyone else, but preparing them in their own tradition. Soon, American staff began finding reasons to be near the kitchen on those days. Guards volunteered for duty during Italian meals. The camp doctor noted improved spirits not just among the prisoners, but among the American personnel as well. The aromas that drifted from the kitchen each Thursday became a kind of language, speaking of places most Americans had never seen. For the Italian prisoners, the opportunity to cook brought back a sense of identity, of dignity. They were no longer just captured enemy soldiers. They were men with knowledge, with culture, with something valuable to share. And share they did, first through food itself, then through the stories that naturally emerged around meals. Guards who had viewed the prisoners as faceless enemies began to see individuals: the baker from Naples, the fisherman's son from Sicily, the farmer from Tuscany. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, in charge of work details, noticed the change first. "These men work harder after cooking days," he reported to Anderson. "It's like they remember who they were before the war." The captain, initially skeptical, could not deny the evidence. Incidents of depression decreased. Cooperation increased. And throughout the camp, a sense of curiosity was growing, not just about Italian food, but about the culture it represented. Americans began asking questions. What region are you from? What would you cook for a wedding? How does your mother make this sauce? Frank Miller, perhaps the most transformed by the experience, began spending his off-duty hours with Rossi, notebook in hand. "Show me again how you know when the dough is right," he would say, his calloused fingers trying to replicate the Italian's confident touch. Miller had cooked his entire life, but he had never considered that food could be more than sustenance. Now, watching Rossi close his eyes to judge the flavor of a sauce by smell alone, he glimpsed a relationship with cooking that bordered on art. "My wife won't recognize me when I get home," he joked one evening. "I'll be serving her pasta instead of pot roast." By Christmas of 1943, what had begun as a concession to prisoner morale had evolved into something the camp administration could never have anticipated, a cultural exchange centered around the kitchen. The barriers remained. Guards still carried rifles, prisoners still lived behind wire. But something else had emerged alongside the strict protocols of captivity, a tentative, fragile respect, a recognition of shared humanity expressed through the breaking of bread. And as 1943 gave way to a new year, no one could have predicted how this quiet revolution would spread beyond the kitchen and beyond the camp itself. Winter in Louisiana brought cold rains and early darkness, but inside Camp Clybourne's mess hall, something warm was growing. The weekly Italian cooking had evolved into an unofficial cooking school. What began with just Rossi and a few others now included dozens of prisoners, eager to share their regional specialties. The Americans, initially skeptical observers, had become willing students. Frank Miller had given up any pretense of disinterest, openly apprenticing himself to the Italians. Even Captain Anderson occasionally appeared at the kitchen door, watching with poorly disguised fascination. "In my village," Paolo Conti explained to a group of American guards one evening, his hands moving expressively as he demonstrated how to shape pasta, "this is how the women have made orecchiette for centuries." The small, ear-shaped pasta took form under his fingers, each piece slightly different, perfectly imperfect. The guards leaned closer, their faces showing concentration rather than suspicion. One young private from Iowa attempted to mimic the motion, his large hands clumsy but determined. "Like this?" he asked, holding up his misshapen creation. Conti laughed warmly. "For first time, better than my brother after 10 years. The atmosphere in these informal classes carried a peculiar kind of magic. For a few hours, the men on both sides seemed to forget their assigned roles. They became simply people, sharing knowledge, laughing over mistakes, celebrating small victories." When Private James Wilson successfully created his first proper pasta dough, the Italian prisoners applauded him as though he had accomplished something momentous. And perhaps he had, for in learning to make pasta as Italians did, he was learning to see them as people with traditions worth preserving, with expertise worth respecting. For the Italians, teaching became a form of reclaiming dignity. In captivity, they had been stripped of status, of freedom, of identity. But here, in the kitchen, they were masters again, authorities whose opinions mattered, whose knowledge was valued. Rossi, who had been a restaurant chef in civilian life, felt himself standing straighter during these sessions. "When I teach, I am not prisoner," he confided to Bianchi one night. "For a little time, I am myself again." The transformation extended beyond cooking techniques. As hands worked together over bowls of flour and pots of simmering sauce, conversation flowed more freely. The Americans spoke of their hometowns, their families, their dreams for when the war ended. The Italians shared stories of village festivals, of grandmothers who guarded secret recipes, of the particular qualities of olive oil from different regions. These exchanges rarely touched on politics or the war itself. Perhaps by unspoken agreement, those subjects remained off-limits. Instead, they found common ground in the universal experiences of family, of home, of food as an expression of love and belonging. Lieutenant Hayes, observing this development with interest, noted in his weekly report, "The cooking program continues to yield unexpected benefits. Disciplinary issues have declined. Communication has improved, even accounting for language barriers. There appears to be growing mutual respect between prisoners and guards. What he did not include, though he had observed it himself, was how the Americans had begun to bring small gifts to the kitchen. Extra herbs from home gardens in town, a vanilla bean smuggled from a care package, once even a bottle of wine that no one officially acknowledged. These offerings, simple but significant, spoke of relationships evolving beyond the prescribed boundaries of captor and captive. As spring arrived, bringing warmth and new growth to the Louisiana landscape, the kitchen program expanded in an unexpected direction. Families in the nearby town of Alexandria began to hear about the Italian cooks through guards who returned home with newfound culinary enthusiasm. Curiosity spread. Local officials, after considerable negotiation with Camp Claiborne's administration, arranged for a small group of Italian prisoners to prepare a meal for a community fundraiser supporting the war effort. The irony was lost on no one. Enemy prisoners cooking to raise money for the American military. Yet somehow it made perfect sense. The day of the fundraiser dawned clear and bright. Rossi, Bianchi, Conti, and 3 others were transported under guard to the Alexandria Town Hall, where they found a kitchen stocked with ingredients and a room full of curious Americans waiting to taste authentic Italian cuisine. The prisoners worked with focused intensity, aware of the strange significance of the moment. They were still captives, still enemies according to the official narrative, yet here they stood preparing food for the very community that housed their prison. The meal they created became the stuff of local legend. Simple dishes, pasta with fresh tomato sauce, risotto with spring vegetables, braised chicken with herbs, but prepared with such care and knowledge that they transported diners to another world. The townspeople, many of whom had never experienced Italian food beyond occasional spaghetti with meatballs, found themselves captivated. They asked questions, requested recipes, studied the prisoners' techniques with genuine interest. For their part, the Italians served each plate with dignity and pride, their status as prisoners temporarily eclipsed by their role as cultural ambassadors. Martha Jenkins, whose son was fighting in Italy at that very moment, found herself seated across from Rossi as he explained the importance of fresh basil in his sauce. The irony struck her suddenly. Here she was, learning from a man her boy might have faced in battle. She studied his face. Kind eyes, work-roughened hands, the same look of concentration her father had shown when teaching her to bake. "My son," she said abruptly, "is in Naples now." Rossi's hands stilled. The unspoken question hung between them. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Naples is beautiful city," he replied softly. I hope he sees it in peace, not war. Something passed between them in that moment. Not forgiveness exactly, for that was not theirs to give or receive, but a recognition of the senseless divisions that had turned neighbors in the human family into enemies. The Alexandria fundraiser raised over $800 for the war effort, an impressive sum for a small Louisiana town. But its real value could not be measured in money. Connections had been formed. Perspective shifted. When the prisoners returned to camp that evening, they carried with them dozens of handwritten notes, thanks from townspeople, requests for recipes, even a few invitations to correspond. Captain Anderson, reviewing these messages for security purposes, found himself moved despite his military reserve. "These men," he told Hayes the next morning, "are changing how this town thinks about the enemy." What he didn't say, though both men understood it, was that the Italians were changing how the camp thought about them as well. As news of the successful fundraiser spread, other communities in the region began making similar requests. The camp administration, recognizing both the public relations value and the positive effect on prisoner morale, cautiously approved selected events. Throughout that spring and summer, Italian prisoners from Camp Claiborne traveled to church suppers, hospital fundraisers, and community gatherings, always under guard, but increasingly treated less as captives and more as honored guests. They cooked, they taught, they shared stories of their homeland. Frank Miller, who now accompanied these groups as both security and fellow chef, noticed how the prisoners stood taller with each outing, their movements more confident, their smiles more genuine. "They're remembering who they are," he told Hayes one evening as they drove back to camp. "Not soldiers, not prisoners, but people with something to give." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "Isn't that true of all of us?" he replied. "Strip away the uniforms and the sides, and what's left is just people who want to create something good." The question lingered between them as the truck rumbled through the Louisiana night, carrying men who had somehow found a path towards something that, if not quite friendship, felt remarkably close to it. Summer's heat settled over Camp Clybourne like a heavy blanket, but within the confines of the wire, life had assumed a rhythm that few could have predicted in those first anxious days of captivity. The Italian cooking program, once an experiment in morale improvement, had become the heart of camp life. 3 days a week now, prisoners taught classes not just to guards and kitchen staff, but to officers' wives, local teachers, even the mayor of Alexandria and his family. The Americans brought notebooks and growing skill. The Italians brought patience and generations of culinary wisdom. Captain Anderson, watching this flourishing exchange with a mixture of pride and disbelief, had become one of its strongest advocates. In reports to his superiors, he detailed the program's benefits: improved discipline, better health among prisoners, positive community relations, even potential intelligence value, as prisoners spoke more freely in these relaxed settings. What he mentioned less officially was how the program had changed him personally. How he now brought his wife to Sunday sessions, how she and Rossi had developed a warm rapport over discussions of regional Italian variations on pasta sauce. The change in the prisoners was profound. Their posture had straightened, their eyes had brightened. They organized themselves into teaching teams based on regional cuisines, created hand-drawn instructional materials, even began learning English more seriously to better communicate with their students. "They're not just cooking," observed Dr. Matthews, the camp physician. "They're reconstructing their identities." In the strange limbo of captivity, where they were neither soldiers nor civilians, the kitchen had given them purpose. For the Americans, the transformation was equally significant. Guards who had once viewed the Italians with suspicion now greeted them by name, discussed recipes, sometimes even brought photographs of their families trying Italian dishes at home. Frank Miller had undergone perhaps the most dramatic change, from skeptic to devoted apprentice. He now spent every free moment with the Italian cooks, his notebook filled with recipes and techniques. "When this war ends," he told Rossi one afternoon, "I'm going to open a real Italian restaurant, and you're going to show me Italy someday." Rossi had smiled at this, though a shadow crossed his face. "After war, who knows?" he replied softly. "Italy will be a different place." This was the reality that hovered beneath the warmth of their culinary exchange, the knowledge that outside the camp, the war continued. Italy had surrendered to the Allies in September 1943, but fighting still ravaged the country as Germans occupied the north and Allied forces pushed upward from the south. The prisoners received letters describing homes destroyed, fields burned, families displaced. They cooked dishes from regions they were not sure would still exist as they remembered them when they returned. This poignancy gave their cooking an almost sacred quality. Each dish prepared, each technique taught, became an act of preservation, not just of recipes, but of cultural memory. When Conti showed the Americans how to make the special Easter bread his grandmother had baked in their village outside Rome, his hands trembled slightly. The village had been bombed. He did not know if his grandmother had survived. Yet here, thousands of miles from home, her recipe lived on through him. The Americans, sensing the weight of these moments, received such teachings with appropriate reverence. As summer turned to fall, the program expanded in yet another unexpected direction. Local schools, hearing of the Italian cooks, requested educational visits. After much discussion regarding security and propriety, the camp administration approved a limited series of demonstrations at the Alexandria High School. The prisoners would teach cooking to home economics classes, with guards present but unobtrusive. It was a bold experiment, allowing enemy prisoners to interact with American teenagers, but one that Captain Anderson believed would benefit both sides. The first school visit revealed yet another dimension of the program's impact. The Italian prisoners, dressed in their cleanest uniforms with improvised chef's aprons, entered the high school classroom with visible nervousness. Before them sat 20 teenage girls, equally uncertain about this unusual lesson. But as Rossi began to demonstrate how to make a simple pasta dough, the atmosphere quickly warmed. The girls asked questions eagerly, laughed at the Italians' expressive gestures, and threw themselves into trying the techniques with teenage enthusiasm. Watching from the back of the room, Lieutenant Hayes observed something remarkable. These young Americans, who had grown up with war headlines and enemy propaganda, were seeing beyond the prisoner label to the individuals beneath. Similarly, the Italians, many of whom had been told that Americans were materialistic and uncultured, were discovering the natural curiosity and warmth of these young people. Barriers of nationality, age, and circumstance seemed to dissolve in the simple act of creating food together. 17-year-old Elizabeth Parker, rolling pasta dough under Bianchi's patient guidance, paused suddenly. "My brother's fighting in Italy right now," she said, looking up at the prisoner. The room quieted. Bianchi nodded solemnly. "I hope he comes home safe to you," he replied in careful English. "And I hope my brother's safe too." Elizabeth studied his face for a long moment, then resumed rolling. "I'll pray for your brother also," she said simply. Hayes, watching this exchange, felt something tighten in his chest. The recognition of how war made enemies of people who, in another life, might have been neighbors, friends, even family. The school program continued throughout the fall, expanding to include other classes and eventually other schools.
I prigionieri preparavano lesson plans, creati handwritten recipe booklets, even worked with the art department per disegnare certificati per studenti che masteravano particolari tecniche. For young Americans, cui immagine di italiani ed era been shaped interamente per wall propaganda, these incontri offrivano un potente counter-narrativo. Dei sanno non nemici, ma teachers, non frightening foreigners, ma men che missavano le loro famiglie, che took pride nel loro culture, che potevano laugh ed earn alongside them. Per i prigionieri, these school visits brought una speciale kind of healing. Many avevano figli del loro becchi in Italia, figli che non vedevano da anni e che erano cresciuti senza loro. Tecere American teenagers allo è loro di riconnettere con quel ruolo, to guide, to nurture, to share wisdom con la next generazione. Rossi, cui do figli aveva ben 7 quando lui la sovvide, trovò particolare soglia in tecere young girls su age. "When I showed them how to make pasta," he told Dr. A.
Matthews, during a checkup, "I imagine I teach my Sophia. Someday, when I go home, I will teach her for real." As 1944 drew to a close, the cooking program had transformed Camp Clybourne in ways no one could have predicted. What began as a simple request by homesick prisoners had evolved into a community institution that reached beyond barbed wire into schools, churches, and homes throughout the region. The kitchen had become a place where guards and prisoners worked side by side, where captivity's sharp edges had softened into something more complex. Not friendship exactly, the war and their respective roles prevented that, but a kind of mutual respect that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. Christmas approached, bringing with it a bittersweet awareness that this would be yet another holiday spent far from home. For the Italian prisoners, many of whom came from deeply religious families, the season carried special significance. Sensing their melancholy, Captain Anderson approved a special Christmas Eve dinner prepared entirely by the Italians, not just for themselves, but for all camp personnel who wished to attend. It would be, he announced, a celebration of what they had built together during this strange year of captivity and connection. The preparation began days in advance. The Italians planned an elaborate feast, drawing from all regions of their homeland. Pasta courses, fish dishes, meat preparations, and traditional Christmas sweets. The Americans helped where they could, securing special ingredients, assisting with the more labor-intensive preparations. Frank Miller worked alongside Rossi, as though they were partners rather than captor and captive, their hands moving in synchronized rhythm after months of cooking together. Throughout the kitchen, Italian and English mingled freely, punctuated by laughter and the occasional good-natured argument about proper technique. On Christmas Eve, the camp mess hall was transformed. Tables covered with makeshift cloths, candles placed in jars,
pine boughs gathered from the surrounding woods arranged as decoration. As darkness fell, guards and prisoners alike entered this temporary sanctuary, momentarily setting aside the divisions that defined their daily existence. Captain Anderson, standing to offer a brief welcome, looked out over the gathered faces and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. "Tonight," he said simply, "we are not guards and prisoners. We are people sharing a meal, remembering home, and hoping for peace." The feast that followed became legendary in Camp Claiborne's history. 7 courses served with pride and received with genuine appreciation. Wine appeared, officially non-existent, but somehow present. And toasts were made to absent families, to survival, to the end of war. Rossi and his fellow cooks moved among the tables, explaining dishes, accepting compliments, momentarily transformed from captives to hosts. As the meal progressed, an Italian prisoner with a fine tenor voice began to sing softly, a Christmas carol known to both cultures. Others joined, American and Italian voices blending in harmony that transcended language. Lieutenant Hayes, watching this scene unfold, leaned toward Dr. Matthews. "If someone had told me a year ago that we'd be celebrating Christmas with Italian prisoners, sharing their food and singing together, I'd have said they were crazy." Matthews nodded thoughtfully. "Food is powerful medicine," he replied. "It reminds us all of our common humanity." Across the room, Frank Miller raised his glass to Rossi, who returned the gesture with a smile that, for a moment at least, contained no shadows of captivity or war.
As 1944 gave way to 1945, as winter yielded to spring, the war in Europe moved toward its inevitable conclusion. News reached Camp Claiborne of Allied advances, of German retreats, of Italy's slow and painful liberation. For the prisoners, these reports brought mixed emotions. Joy at the prospect of eventual return home, anxiety about what they would find there, uncertainty about how they would reintegrate into a transformed society. The cooking program continued, perhaps more vital than ever as a source of normalcy and purpose in these unsettled times. In May, as flowers bloomed across Louisiana, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Though fighting continued in the Pacific, the end of the conflict that had brought the Italians to Louisiana was now in sight. Repatriation plans began taking shape, with the first groups of prisoners scheduled to return to Italy by autumn. The announcement, while welcome, cast a strange shadow over Camp Claiborne. After more than 2 years together, the community that had formed around food and cultural exchange faced dissolution. Realization dawned slowly among both prisoners and Americans. Their time together was limited. The cooking classes took on new urgency. Final recipes to be shared, techniques to be mastered, regional variations to be recorded. Frank Miller worked feverishly alongside Rossi, documenting everything he could. "You're taking a piece of my homeland with you," Rossi told him one afternoon, watching the Americans' careful notes. Miller looked up, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "And you're leaving a piece of yourself here," he replied. Between them lay a stack of recipe cards, physical manifestations of a connection neither had expected to form. Throughout Alexandria and surrounding communities, families who had come to know the Italian cooks through classes, fundraisers, and school demonstrations received the news of their impending departure with genuine regret. Letters arrived at the camp, invitations for final visits, requests for specific recipes, expressions of gratitude. The local newspaper published an editorial praising the program's contribution to cultural understanding. Mayor Thompson of Alexandria even sent a formal letter to military authorities commending the prisoners' positive influence on community relations and educational enrichment. As summer faded into autumn, the first departure lists were posted. Rossi, Bianchi, and Conti found their names among those scheduled to leave in October. The knowledge gave every remaining cooking session a bittersweet quality, each demonstration potentially the last, each shared meal a farewell. Captain Anderson, recognizing the significance of what was ending, approved a special community event, one final large-scale dinner prepared by the Italian prisoners for both camp personnel and selected townspeople who had participated in the program over the years. The farewell dinner took place on a golden October evening, the Louisiana sky painted in shades of amber and rose. Tables had been set up in the camp's outdoor recreation area, decorated with flowers and candles. Nearly 200 people gathered: guards, officers, teachers, students, families who had welcomed the Italians into their kitchens and lives. The prisoners had prepared for days, creating a feast that represented every region of Italy, every technique they had taught, every recipe that had built bridges across wartime divisions. As the meal began, Captain Anderson rose to speak. His voice, usually firm and authoritative, carried a note of emotion rarely heard. 2 years ago, he said, looking out over the assembled faces, these men arrived as our enemies. Today, they leave as, he paused, searching for the right word, not as friends, perhaps, for war makes true friendship difficult, but as people we have come to respect, to learn from, and to value. What began in this camp's kitchen has changed us all. It has reminded us that humanity persists even in war's darkest moments, and that breaking bread together can sometimes heal what violence has broken. The meal that followed was more than food. It was testament to what had been built in this unlikely place. Each dish carried stories and memories. The pasta sauce Rossi had first demonstrated to skeptical Americans, the regional specialties that had transported homesick prisoners back to villages and cities across Italy, the fusion creations born of American ingredients and Italian techniques. As they ate, guards and prisoners, townspeople and officers all found themselves sharing memories of the program, the disasters and triumphs, the laughter and occasional tears, the gradual transformation of strangers into something more complicated than enemies, yet precious in its own way. After the meal, in a moment that would be remembered long after the war faded into history, Frank Miller presented Rossi with a handmade book. Inside were hundreds of recipes, some written by the Italians themselves, others transcribed by Americans who had learned from them, all meticulously organized by region and type. "So we don't forget," Miller said simply, his voice rough with emotion. Rossi accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, his mother's silver spoon, carried with him throughout the war as a talisman of home. "For your restaurant," he said, pressing it into Miller's palm. "So peace of Italia stays with you." 2 weeks later, the first group of Italian prisoners left Camp Claiborne. They departed not under heavy guard, but with handshakes, embraces, and promises to write. Captain Anderson and Lieutenant Hayes stood at the gate as the trucks pulled away, watching until they disappeared from view. "Do you think they'll remember us?" Hayes asked quietly. Anderson nodded, his eyes fixed on the empty road. "Not as captors," he replied, "but as people who broke bread with them during the strangest years of their lives. And we'll remember them the same way." In the decades that followed, as the world rebuilt from war's devastation, the connections forged in Camp Claiborne's kitchens proved surprisingly durable. Letters crossed the Atlantic in both directions. Frank Miller writing to Rossi about his restaurant plans, Rossi responding with updates on Italy's reconstruction. Recipes continued to be exchanged, family news shared. Some of the Americans eventually traveled to Italy, welcomed by their former prisoners in homes and restaurants across the country. A few Italians returned to Louisiana as visitors, marveling at their changed perspective on a land they had once viewed only through barbed wire. The cooking program that had begun with a simple request, "Let us cook for you," had created a legacy that outlived the war itself. Throughout Alexandria and beyond, Italian cooking became part of local culture, taught by Americans who had learned from the prisoners. Frank Miller did indeed open his restaurant in 1947, naming it Rossi's in honor of the man who had transformed his understanding of food. It became a gathering place for veterans and townspeople alike, a living memorial to connections that had transcended conflict. Perhaps the truest measure of the program's impact came in the quiet, personal moments that followed the war. When Rossi's daughter finally received her cooking lessons from her returned father, she learned techniques he had refined while teaching Americans in Louisiana. When Miller's son attended college in Rome years later, Rossi's family welcomed him as their own. When Captain Anderson's wife created a community cookbook in the 1950s, she dedicated it to "our Italian teachers," who reminded us that sharing food is the first step towards sharing humanity.
What had begun in steam and skepticism had evolved into something no military strategist could have planned, no propaganda could have countered. The recognition, plate by plate and recipe by recipe, that enemies are created by politics, but unmade by personal connection.
In the simple act of teaching Americans to cook pasta, Italian prisoners of war had demonstrated a truth more powerful than any weapon, that even in war's darkest moments, human beings retain the capacity to see beyond labels to the individuals beneath, to find common ground in breaking bread, and, sometimes, against all odds, to forge bonds that last a lifetime.